Welcome back from lunch. Y'all good? Y'all fed? Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll try that one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Nikki Lane. I'm an assistant professor in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies department here at Duke. And it is, it's so lovely to see you all here. Thank you for joining us here on this stunningly beautiful day here in Durham. This happens to me every year at FTW, and I wonder if this is happening to you, but we get the opportunity to meet so many of the scholars whose work we engage with when we're sitting alone in our offices or our cubicles, or I'm recalling adjuncting and the dusty basement storage closets that they call offices. But rarely do we get an opportunity to not only sit next to, but be engaged in meaningful conversation with the people that we're wrestling ideas, we're kind of would get to talk to them about those ideas that we're wrestling from our heads and trying to get down on the page. So I hope that you'll take a brief moment right now just to introduce yourself to your neighbor, and we'll do it black church style. Please turn to your neighbor and say, "Hey, neighbor." Good. Now turn to your other neighbor. Turn to your other neighbor. I'm so glad you're here. All right. Let's come back. Come on back. Come on back. Good. I love it. I hear it. I hear that fellowship. Let's get into it. I have the distinct pleasure this afternoon of introducing a Titan. She's not a tall woman, but she is a giant, at least to me. And before I had the pleasure of seeing her a couple years ago at North Star Church of the Arts here in Durham, talking about what was then her most recent book, Read Until You Understand, I really thought you were at least 5'9". I'm here to introduce a living legend, Farah Jasmine Griffin. When I read In Search of a Beautiful Freedom, her 2023 book, which collects essays and retrospectives of her work spanning 30 years of a life and mind that are steeped in African American culture and literary traditions, I was struck by her discussion in the introduction of her love of the essay, not the least because we share that love. But quoting her dear friend Cheryl Wall, Griffin describes the essay as opening, quote, a window into the writer's mind. And then she does just that for us over 27 essays. She gives us a peek into the mind of not only a literary critic and music critic, a historian, an educator, but herself as an artist. Dr. Griffin is the author of 7 books, including Who Set You Flowin', The African American Migration Narrative, that's Oxford University Press, 1995. If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, that's 2001, UNC Press, and Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature, and that's 2021. With W.W. Norton. Dr. Griffin is the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and American Studies at Columbia University, a 2021 recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Philly native. Hey, Philly, what's up? As I have read Farah Jasmine Griffin's work, I noticed something about what it is that she's always done for me as a reader over the course of my own intellectual journey. Read until you understand. Chapter 2 of If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery is titled Ladylike, How We Know, What We Think We Know About Billie Holiday. The first section of In Search of a Beautiful Freedom is titled Learning How to Listen. When you read her essay, Zora Neale Hurston's Radical Individualism, what I can't help but remark upon is how Griffin continuously helps me to clarify how it is that I come to think about the things that I think about. In other words, she helps me to slow down and think deeply about my thinking, metacognition. I think this is the art of a great teacher, to challenge us intellectually to understand where our ideas come from, to model rigor and depth in ways that illuminate new pathways for ourselves, but also, simply put, to teach us how to read. Griffin models this for us in Read Until You Understand, where she is able to name her influences. And she writes, quote, "In the questions that I raise throughout these pages, I have been deeply influenced by a lifelong intellectual, aesthetic, political, and spiritual engagement with the writings of the late Toni Morrison. Informed by her writing, I ask a series of questions, a series of questions of selected works by Black writers. The authors do not posit or forward a system of ethics, but they do seem to bear witness to one that emerges from the community about whom they write. In the midst of a hostile society, a society that wants our labor, our death, we live in pursuit of justice, in pursuit of freedom, and longing for a bit of grace. How shall we live? How shall we treat each other? How shall we treat our compatriots, some of whom are guilty of crimes against us?" End quote. Dr. Griffin's work over the past 30 years has interrogated the Great Migration and its relationship to African American literature, jazz as both musical and intellectual tradition, the history of Black women intellectuals, artists, activists, and the way literature is in and of itself a radical tool of individual and social transformation. The title of her talk today, ooh, it's so good, y'all. The abundant in-between time. I look forward to being in conversation with Dr. Griffin today, and I hope you are as well. Please join me in welcoming Farah Jasmine Griffin.
Thank you. Now I have to live up to that. Oh my goodness. Good afternoon. There are a lot of you. When I'm sitting up here, I don't realize how many of you there are, but thank you for choosing to share this beautiful afternoon with me. I appreciate your doing so and appreciate your presence. I want to thank Nikki for that wonderful introduction, for taking the time to read my work. I want to thank Jennifer for all she's done and for gathering us here together. I want to thank Jason and Kayla and everyone who is responsible for getting us here safely and hosting us. I want to thank the Barbaras. Yeah, so much. You've been so wonderful. And I also want to thank my fellow Keynote speakers for your brilliance and the diversity of your thought. This has been just so rich that we could gather and be such different thinkers and writers, and yet I think the talks all resonate with each other. The abundant in-between time will make sense as we go along. Lately, I've been thinking about how the historic figures, the creative and intellectual women I've studied over the years, have addressed and lived through and confronted repressive and reactionary times. And studying Black culture is also a reminder that much of U.S. history has been repressive, that throughout the nation's history, many Black Americans have always lived under varying forms of authoritarianism. What mechanisms have they put in place? What vehicles have they used to help navigate, resist, or simply survive, and in some instances, thrive and flourish? While much of the project that I'm going to share with you today looks at pairs of friends, I want to talk with you today about a small group of women, what I call a circle, with attention to just a few members of that group. But first, I'll talk a bit about the larger project from which it's drawn, with attention, and then a little bit about the framework that I'm developing to talk about this particular group and the time that brings them together. The larger project from which this is drawn covers a series of friendship portraits. The relationships I explore help the participants create and sustain dimensions and definitions of themselves that counter the roles society ascribed to them. However fraught or complex, at some point, friendship is a site of recognition and affirmation, a site of cultivating a vision of possibility in a world that too often denies them all of these things. It is a place where they transcend limitations and invisibility, a place where their creativity is expressed, recognized, encouraged, and appreciated. From the plantation through the dawn of the 21st century, friendship, or more often, sisterhood, quite possibly is one of the few spaces where they experience mutuality and reciprocity instead of the constant demand to nurture others. It should not be surprising that women's friendship has been central to the development of Black women's writing and Black feminist theory from the very beginning. Whether Morrison's Safe Harbor or Zora Neale Hurston's Tongue in My Friend's Mouth, Black women's literature has sought to portray the centrality and necessity of friendship in Black women's lives. And theorists such as Patricia Hill Collins and historians like Deborah Gray White have examined the life-giving, indeed life-preserving nature of Black women's friendship networks. My colleague, Jafari Allen, has noted that friendship has, quote, served as a salve against the daily onslaught of racialized misogyny and gendered racism, and as a way to go about the work of personal and social transformation. So this is what I examine in the larger project. And I should say early studies of feminist history, and I'm sort of reluctant to talk about feminist history, given our keynote yesterday, but this is a contribution to that, also talked about forms of friendship. But today, I'm going to talk about a group of friends. For a little over a decade, spanning from the mid-50s to the late 60s, the writer Maya Angelou, the singer Abby Lincoln, and the novelist Paul Marshall were all part of a circle of Black women, all friends to differing degrees, based in New York, pursuing artistic careers and attempting to marry their political commitments to Black freedom with their artistic vision and aspirations. I want to talk a little bit about the word circle. I'm intentionally returning to this rather old-fashioned term to describe the group of artists and thinkers here. It has been used to describe groups of friends or literary or artistic or social groups that gather regularly, that produce work together individually. It's an old term, but I find it attractive for a number of reasons here, in that it is expansive. I see it as having no beginning or end. Different participants have differing degrees of individual closeness. It suggests a kind of enclosure, but one that allows for a coming and going, a gathering, a nesting. And then the in-between time, another term that I will employ here, is a temporal description. While the in-between time is a temporal description, the circle is a spatial metaphor. In this instance, there are often overlapping circles. The memberships can cross gender, but women sit at the center. They come together most often in social gatherings and salons, but can be called upon in personal and political crises. They can become organizing units. They constitute a kind of culture. The reason I came to think of Maya Angelou, Abby Lincoln, and Paul Marshall, and to a lesser degree, figures like the novelist Rosa Guy, Louise Merriweather, and the vocalist Miriam Makeba, as a circle representative of a time and a particular kind of ethos, as the potential subject of a scholarly project, is because I encountered them in the collective biographies of Angelou. This is the collected autobiographies of Maya Angelou. That's what they look like. And then if you put them together, the spines of the book form that portrait of her. While I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is her most famous, and that title comes from the Paul Laurence Dunbar poem, but it's a title that was given to Angelou's autobiography by Abby Lincoln. Abby Lincoln titled that first book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, is the story of her childhood and girlhood and is the most well-known of Angelou's biographies. It's a true classic of the genre. It's the two later ones, especially The Heart of a Woman, published in 1981, and All God's Children Have Traveling Shoes, published in 1986, that have come to be especially meaningful for a number of us, in large part because of the circles of friendship that it describes and because it gives us a glimpse into a little-studied era and the way that it helped shape women who would later become important artists and intellectuals, giving us some of their most enduring works. The portraits of them in the pages of Angelou's books flesh them out as multidimensional figures, giving a sense of the development of their political and aesthetic sensibilities. Angelou's autobiography suggests a rubric for talking about them together, and it has inspired what I am calling an abundant in-between time. This phrase does two things in that it describes a period in their lives and careers, but beyond them and in ways that might be helpful to you all, whomever you're talking about, it also provides a way of talking about historical eras. It gestures, I think, also towards an aesthetic as well. Considering the in-between time encourages us to look at those times and places that are lacunae in our documented histories. I've always been especially interested in those periods between the big events. Like right now, we're living through a big event, right? So, and we know we're living through a big event. And it will be looked back upon, I think, like you were right, the ancient Greeks didn't know they were ancient Greeks, but we know we're living through a big event. And I think it will be looked back upon, I think, as a big event. But there are these periods that don't get a certain kind of historical attention. In African American cultural histories, we often jump from the emergence of James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison in the early 1950s over to the Black arts movement in the late 60s and 70s. And when focusing on Black women, we might make note of Gwendolyn Brooks in the early 50s, maybe the publication of Brown Girl Brownstones in 1959, and then we jump right to the 1970s with Toni Morrison and all those great Black women writers who come out in the 1970s. But for our purposes, this in-between time is a period following Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, I would say even from 1956 to 1966. And it's a time that internationally figures like Nkrumah, Lumumba, Malcolm X, that the political movements that lead us into the March on Washington, the independence movements in various African countries, when we get a bunch of Black artists on film, and in plays, not just Lorraine Hansberry's plays, but a series of significant plays, and a kind of public emergence of a public intellectual life starts to happen that just hasn't been documented. I think of it as a time of great abundance, a period overflowing with creative and political energy and activity that just has not been documented enough. And while I agree with Jennifer Nash in her beautiful book that loss is a central preoccupation of Black feminist writing and theorizing, including my own central preoccupation in Read Until You Understand, I have come to see that in the midst of loss, much of Black life and Black women's cultural history is also defined by a sense of abundance. And that even in the midst of loss, sometimes at the very moment of loss, there is also this somewhat contradictory sense of abundance. So one might think of the author Kiese Lehman's use of the phrase Black abundance, especially in his memoir, Heavy, a phrase full of meaning, which he says connotes a process of becoming, of astounding society's low expectations with unimpeachable excellence. As such, the word points not only toward an overflowing of energy and activity, but also a process of becoming a people, a generation. As an aside, abundance can signal the emergence of life or of an era, but it can also come at the end of a life, the end of an era. It might signify a moment of transition, of passing on or passing through. It is not lost on me that the moment we consider the nadir, the lowest point in African American history, those like 1890s, right, as that feel so much like this moment, the kind of erasure of Black life, is also a moment when Black people responded in incredibly productive and creative ways, producing institutions and intellectual and political works that bore witness to that period, but also helped to navigate a way forward. And oftentimes, those times receive little attention, but they are times of abundance. Angelou's autobiographies identify such an ethos and energy, a sense of community of which she is a part. It is a period that helps to shape the public figure that she would later become, that clears the space for the work with which she would become most well known. The autobiographies give us a sense of the people, the other artists and activists with whom she was associated. In short, drawing upon those two autobiographies and putting them into conversation with sources and archives, and I know that we've talked about the critique of the archive, but here the archive is actually abundant. It's not a state archive which seeks to erase Black women, but it's a self-created archive, created in opposition to what they feared would be erasure. So put into conversation with their archives is very, very rich. So I have conversation with sources from the archives, publications by these other women, including Abby Lincoln, Paul Marshall, Rosa Gee, Louise Merriweather, that flesh out this understudied period before the emergence of the Black arts movement and before the emergence of this renaissance of Black women writers. During what I am calling the in-between time, these women were all based in New York, but they were traveling throughout the world to perform, live, write. They were all working on their craft while building relationships and developing their own political and aesthetic sensibility. And it's very interesting. They were all more Pan-Africanist than diasporic. They were not yet, and in some instances possibly never, feminist. Though they would contribute to the development of a Black feminist sensibility and consciousness, they nonetheless saw themselves as modern global Black women still bound by, but in search of new understandings of gender and sexuality. And for some of them, they would find in feminism that new understanding of gender and sexuality. I want to just say a word about the distinction I'm making between Pan-African and diaspora. Diaspora focuses on dispersal and often absents or minimizes Africa. These women were explicitly Pan-Africanist in that they centered Africa, even if they often romanticized it. They were engaged in a living, contemporary Africa, informed by the politics of various emerging African nations. They were ensconced in community with Ghanaians, South Africans, and others from throughout the continent, and themselves eventually traveling back and forth between the continent and the United States and Caribbean. In fact, the era about which I write is one in which Black American communities, the Black press, were becoming more and more familiar with contemporary events on the continent, in which Black leaders were drawing connections between and building solidarity with the Black American freedom movement and independence movement in Ghana, on the continent and in the Caribbean. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, each of the women about whom I write found herself outside of the United States in Black majority countries, creating works that are deserving of our continued attention and appreciation. In between times are movement building times. They allow for the development of critical vocabularies and frames for understanding the social realities in which we find ourselves. They are capacious. They allow for flexibility, a sense of coming into being before definitions are chosen and before lines are harshly drawn. This period is beginning to get more attention And my own work has benefited greatly from scholars who have started to fill in the gaps. Biographies of Lorraine Hansberry by Imani Perry and Soyika Diggs are starting points. Ruth Feldstein's How It Feels to Be Free, Black Women Entertainers in the Civil Rights Movement. Soyika Colbert is working on a book. I haven't seen anything from it yet, but we have talked about it, tentatively titled Freedom's Gate, looking at both Lorraine Hansberry, Angelo Abbey Lincoln, and the time that they worked together in a nightclub in New York. So all of these people are, beginning to flesh out this area. Two significant works, Mary Helen Washington's The Other Black List, which calls our attention to the leftist politics in the lives and works of Black writers during the 1950s, looking at the cultural histories of McCarthyism as well as conventional Black cultural histories that have failed to include radical Black artists. Her book opens up this period in very generative ways. And then a book that reaches beyond the period under consideration, but offers a framework that helps to suggest a way of understanding the activities in which the women were engaged, and that's The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and the Culture of U.S. Empire by Erica Edwards, which encourages us to look at the ways that the writers of the 70s not only were looking at the kind of birth of Black feminism, but the ways that they, quote, exposed assumptions undergirding the long war and terror and offered perspectives on race, gender, and state violence. So what I take from Washington is a sense of encouragement to look more deeply into a period that has received less attention for the relationship between political and cultural sensibilities, in part shaped by the period she uncovers. And from Edwards, I'm spurred to look not only at what these women have to say about intra-racial gender politics, but more importantly, the development of their political sensibility, which also includes but is not limited to gender politics. What I am considering a Pan-Africanist, perhaps proto-Black feminism that would ultimately shape their most important and ambitious projects. I use the hyphenate compound in between to modify time and to connote a sense of intermediateness. I want to suggest that this period joins eras rather than separates them, rather as between on its own would do. The period that I'm identifying follows the formal end of segregation, although we know that communities fought that well into the 1970s, but it follows the formal end of segregation, the newly energized domestic civil rights movement, the independence movements in Africa. I mark the period beginning in 1956 when Angelo moves to New York at the encouragement of the founder of the Harlem Writers Guild, John Oliver Killens, and her friend Abby Lincoln, who had moved a few years earlier. Angelo would live in New York for 2 years before moving with her husband and teenage son to Cairo, Egypt, where she served as editor of the Arab Observer, an English-language newspaper. And in 1961, when newly divorced, she moved to Ghana to become part of a Black American expat community, teaching at the University of Ghana, working as editor of the African Review. And by 1964, she would return to New York in hopes of working for Malcolm X's Organization of African American Unity, hopes, of course, that would be dashed after Minister Malcolm's assassination in 1965. During the 2 years that she found herself in New York prior to leaving for the continent, Angelo was part of a dynamic community of activists, artists, and intellectuals, many of whom would fall between the cracks of our received literary and cultural histories. Even the Harlem Writers Guild, established in 1950 by John Oliver Killens, has left out of literary histories of African American literature. But in the 1950s, the Guild provided a source of community and critique for an emergent generation of writers, and that's why, one of the reasons why Angelo would come to New York to pursue writing. There she would join her sister writers Rosa Gee and Louise Merriweather, among others, who would go on to publish books there. A typical meeting, for instance, of the Harlem Writers Guild would be, they would come, someone would share a piece of work, they would share constructive criticism, and then afterwards they would, after the critique of the work, they would turn to political discussions and then organizing. Paul Marshall, who was probably one of the most gifted of the writers and would become the most well-known of them, also attended those meetings. Maya and Abby Lincoln became fast friends sometime in the mid-1950s, while both were based on the West Coast trying to build careers as entertainers. In The Heart of a Woman, Angelo writes, I had met the singer Abby Lincoln. We met years earlier and we became friends during the time I stayed in the Westlake district. But she had moved to New York City. And whenever I spoke to her on the telephone after she stopped praising Max Roach, the drummer, her love and romantic ideal, she lauded New York City. It was the hub, the absolute middle of the world, the only place for an intelligent person to be and to grow. I used to believe that too. In her own unpublished autobiography, Lincoln recalls sitting at a restaurant bar with her sister-in-law Cynthia when Maya stopped to talk to them. Realizing that Cynthia had a son who was the same age as her own child, Angelo suggested they could be friends. Lincoln recalled, I thought she was so forward, but we were destined to become friends and become part of each other's lives. According to Lincoln, both she and Maya were performing in small clubs and causing sensations. She writes, Maya and I had become fast friends and confidants to one another. We bolstered each other's egos and supported one another and practiced getting drunk. We talked about life and the world, but mostly about men and disappointments and the rewards of some experiences. We were both living in a seedy hotel downtown. It was a place we could afford, waiting for the next job that was hopefully around its way. This was around 1956. Shortly afterwards, Lincoln would relocate to New York primarily to be with the drummer Max Roach, who she would eventually marry in 1962. Maya, partially at Lincoln's encouragement, moved to the city 2 years later in 1958. By the time Lincoln moved to New York, she had already established herself as a starlet on the rise. She'd spent time singing in nightclubs in Hawaii and Latin America and on the West Coast. She had already had a bit part in a Jane Mansfield film, The Girl Can't Help It, and she recorded and released her first album, Abby Lincoln's Affair, the story of a girl in love. Her stage persona, her film appearance, and the album all marked an effort to present her as a sepia sex symbol, but one poised to break through in the vein of Lena Horne and Dorothy Dandridge. However, by the time the film and the album were released in 1956, she was 26 years old and she changed course. So here we have it. She was advertised on the cover of Ebony as being able, she was wearing the same dress that Marilyn Monroe wore. She wore Marilyn Monroe's dress, so she was going to be the Black Marilyn Monroe. But she changed course when she moved to New York and became ensconced in a jazz scene, of which Max Roach was a central part. She began to tentatively write her own lyrics. She said she recalled that it was Maya who encouraged her to write poetry, introduced her to Paul Laurence Dunbar. In New York, she said, I met a circle of Black musicians and other artists. It was the early days of the civil rights movement, and we were all asking the same questions. So within a year, she released her first jazz album, Abby Lincoln and the Riverside Jazz Stars, which included such jazz luminaries as Sonny Rollins, Paul Chambers, and others. And here in that album, we find her experimenting with her phrasing, singing standards made famous by Billie Holiday, and she continued to collaborate with her husband, who would become her husband, most famously on the We Insist Freedom Now suite. While much writing about Lincoln focuses on this state of her career, including my own work, establishing it as a time of her political awakening and her artistic rebirth, when you look at her own unpublished autobiographical writings, Lincoln, while crediting the artists of this period with helping to form and shape her vision, is also quick to note that of all of them, she had the name and the established career before moving to New York. She was also already an astute and observant about what she was witnessing in terms of racial and class stratification. The period in New York gave her a sense of ideology and a terminology for what she had already witnessed. For instance, about her time in Hawaii, she writes, in those days, I had no social or political awareness of the world, but I know now that I was witnessing the downfall of an independent principality. Hawaii was destined to become the United States of America. Corruption is an insidious tool of the devil and always renders the people helpless and defenseless. In Brazil, she was the only Black person to stay in an exclusive hotel, and she says, my social awareness was growing. Everywhere I went in the world was a repeat of where I'd been. The people who I represented had nothing to show for their lives, and the European communities were rich in money and arrogant and uncaring, and I didn't care for them as an audience or for company, and I was lonely. So her move to New York and the community she found there, a community of writers and musicians, politically inclined, creative people, helped to alleviate this sense of loneliness and depression, and also helped to place her artistic aspirations in a generational context. She would still sing and act, but she was more selective about the kinds of roles she played and the materials she recorded. She began to pen her own melodies later, and she emerged as an actress of substance and depth in the independent film Nothing But a Man, and in the romantic comedy starring Sidney Poitier for Love of Ivy. She also helped to organize and co-found the Cultural Association for African Women of African Heritage in 1962. She would appear at a symposium held at the New School, the Negro Writers of Vision in America, on a panel entitled The Negro Woman in American Literature with Paul Marshall, Sarah Wright, Alice Childress. Now, the three of them are leftist feminist writers. But in her comments, she noted that even hostile white writers had to, quote, take note of the depth and single-minded devotion of the love of the Negro woman for the man of her choice. At this time, much of Lincoln's emphasis would be on black women and men together. The other writers would discuss stereotypes of black women created by white writers and black male writers, but Lincoln would always stress unity between black men and women. And she published what would become a classic essay, Who Will Revere the Black Woman, first published in Black Scholar and later in Tony Kaye's anthology, The Black Woman. In her writing, in her public and private life, she emphasized what she saw as the revolutionary nature of black men and women building, working, and living together, creating culture, politics, and as such, a new world and a new nation. Of her own move to New York, Maya Angelou writes that she was singing in a small club on the Lower East Side, and she says, quote, Max and Abby were performing jazz concerts on liberation themes. Lorraine Hansberry had a play on Broadway which told some of the truths about the black American Negro family to new white audiences. James Baldwin had the country in his balled fist with The Fire Next Time. Killings and Then We Heard Thunder told the uncomfortable facts about black soldiers in a white army. Belafonte included South African singer Miriam Makeba in his concerts, engaging his art and increasing his protests against racial abuse. And there I was, still singing clever little songs, only moderately well. I made the decision to give up the skin-tight dresses and manicured smiles, the false concern over sentimental lyrics. I would never again work to make people smile inanely, and I would take on the responsibility of making them think. Now was the time to demonstrate my own seriousness. Her writing is full of paragraphs like this that relay a sense of excitement and energy of the times, and it's what I call an aesthetic of abundance. Names and titles tumble forth, giving a momentum to the paragraph that push her from still singing only moderately well to a new level of political seriousness. Now was the time is an echo of Charlie Bird Parker's Now's the Time, which is recognized as a politicized standard by a generation of musicians. Similar paragraphs appear throughout The Heart of a Woman. Quote, Patrice Lumumba was in New York. Rosa was going to meet him and his assistants. Abby and Max were performing in the Village. Malcolm X was speaking at a public meeting in Harlem. Somewhere Maki was showering his listeners with glittering words. The world was on fire. Paragraph after paragraph virtually tumble forward with mentions of names and works, only one or two of which we would recognize now, but reminding us of the abundance of activity and production and the context in which they were produced. Maya Angelou, Abby Lincoln, Rosa Gee, and others would co-found the Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage, quote, a group of talented black women who would make themselves available to all other groups. We could be on call to perform, give fashion shows, read poetry, sing, write for any organization from SCLC to the Urban League that wanted to put on a fundraising affair. Paul Marshall would join the group as well. During this time, Maya Angelou had planned to marry another man she'd been seeing when she met the South African freedom fighter Visume Maki. She'd met him at Paul Marshall's a party thrown by Paul Marshall, who acted as a kind of matchmaker. Maki began making the hard press of courting Angelou, and all of her friends encouraged her to give in to his pursuits. Resistant to his aggressiveness and his patriarchal leanings, she says, I decided to go to Abby's house. The most called upon prerequisite of a friend is an accessible ear. According to Angelou, Lincoln told her, a man's supposed to be in charge. That's the order of nature. Abby was raising an argument which we had debated for years. Quote, the worst injury of slavery was the white man took was that the white man took away the black man's chance to be in charge of himself, his wife, and his family. Vuss is teaching you that you're not a man, no matter how strong you are. He's going to make you into an African woman. Just watch it. She dismissed the discussion in me, but she didn't know the African women I'd met in London or the legendary women of African stories. I wanted to be a wife and to create a beautiful home and to make a man happy, but there was more to life than being a diligent maid with a permanent pussy. According to Angelo's account, we see the contest over black women's identities and roles as it plays out between friends with different understandings of black femininity based in mythic constructions versus realistic encounters with African women. Paul Marshall recalled the era in which these kinds of conversations and debates were commonplace. Quote, there was a sense that it was almost a disservice to the movement for women to be demanding attention and liberation as women because there was this larger reality of civil rights that we had to address. I remember Abby, a wonderful singer who was living at the time with Max Roach. She really felt she had to stay a few paces behind and defer to him because black men had to be supported and encouraged. And it was very difficult because on the one hand, we felt a need and a desire to embrace the whole larger struggle and perhaps in some regard even to grant primacy to men. And at the same time, we were women who felt a tremendous need to fulfill self. A lot of marriages went on the rocks because of that. Certainly, one of mine did. It was a difficult time because there was always the need to have your own sense of self. That, of course, has been the dilemma of any number of women writers. Marshall may in fact be the first one of this group who came to embrace feminism. She also referred to her second marriage to the Haitian businessman Nori Menard in 1970 as an open marriage. These are the very contests that would animate the volume The Black Women Anthology and that would give birth to the theorization of black feminism. Not long after Angelo's conversation with Lincoln, in January 1961, Angelo heard news of Patrice Lumumba's assassination as she was walking down 125th Street. She'd heard it from her friend Rosa Guy, who reported it from Congolese diplomats that she knew. She said, quote, I said nothing. I knew no words which would match the emptiness of the moment. Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and Sekou Touré were the holy African triumvirate, which radical black Americans held dear, and we needed our leaders desperately. We had been abused, and so long abused that the loss of one here was a setback of such proportion it could dishearten and weaken the struggle. It is this incident which pushes her group into more direct civil disobedience. The two women continue walking and run into a crowd listening to Malcolm X. Malcolm said, every person under the sound of my voice is a soldier. You are either fighting for your freedom or betraying the fight for freedom or enlisted in the army to deny someone else's freedom. And Maya says, after hearing Malcolm, her account of the organizing, announcement, and day of and aftermath of Lumumba's protest, and if you've seen the film Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, then you know exactly what I'm going to narrate now. So she says, Rosa Guy says, we've got to move. We've got to let the Congolese and all the other Africans know that we are with them, whether we come from New York or the South or the West Indies, that black people are people and we are equally oppressed. So the culturalists, they call a meeting of this association that they had organized. There's no formal announcement of his death yet, but they discuss whether or not he's dead. Others thought the organization was just formed to help support black American civil rights struggle. But Abby said, that's stupid. That's a stupid attitude. What happened in Africa affects every black American. And she reminded them that even Martin Luther King had found support in Africa. 6 women decide that they're going to attend the general session of the UN. They'll carry black pieces of cloth. And when Adlai Stevenson starts to make his announcement on Lumumba's death, they would use bobby pins and clips, mourning veils to the front of their hair and stand in the hall. It would be dramatic. Abby says that men will join us. Max and the men will join us, and so as will some West Indian revolutionaries. The men will wear elasticized black armbands. Thus, Maya's intendant says, never allow yourself to be cut off from the people. If you're going to do something, tell the masses. So Abby and Abby and Maya go to a famous bookstore in Harlem, Mr. Michaud's Liberation Bookstore, and he says, expecting that he will just pass the word on to the community, but he says, no, you have to pass the word on to the community. So they tell them, we are members of CAWA, the Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage, and we have learned that our brother Lumumba has been killed in the Congo. We're going to go to the UN. And they say, Maya says, that by the next day, by the time they get to the UN, crowds had gathered, thousands of people circled in the street, and all of them are black. Sister, we're with you. Once inside, others had gotten in, and before they can do their silent demonstration, about 75 black women, some women with veils pinned to their faces. As Adlai Stevenson reaches the microphone, a scream shatters. Murderers, Lumumba, Lumumba, killers, you bigoted sons of bitches. The African diplomats are alarmed. Maya and Abby are shaken because they had not anticipated this. They urge the people to get back out to the street to safety, and then the crowds march to the Belgian consulate. Maya draws this conclusion. She says, the echo of the day's excitement and the wonder of Kawa's power bring all of those people from Harlem kept us quiet for a few minutes. The day had proven that Harlem was in commotion and that the rage was beyond the control of the NAACP, the SCLC, or the Urban League. The fury would turn on itself if not outwardly directed. There would be an increase in stabbings and shootings as black people assaulted each other, discharging tension and blindly looking for secretes of pained lives. And there's this part that I feel like there needs to be further research and investigation beyond Angelo's description of events, because it's quite significant if this little-known, recently organized group of black women would have been responsible for mobilizing large numbers of black Harlemites in response to the assassination of Lumumba. So there has to be a more, and I hope more, historical investigation. But because they had no plan beyond the symbolic act of public mourning, they had not planned what was to follow beyond the public mobilization of the masses. So they went to Malcolm X, and Malcolm chastised them. He said, we know of the demonstrations, but Muslims were not involved in it. The New York Times reporters telephoned me, and I told them Muslims do not demonstrate. And I'll tell you this, you were wrong. You were wrong in your direction. The people of Harlem are angry, and they have reason to be angry, but going to the United Nations shouting and carrying placards will not win freedom for anybody, nor will it keep the white devils from killing another African leader or a black leader. He closed with, I know you are disappointed. I'll tell you this, by 12 o'clock, some Negro leaders are going to be like Peter in your Christian Bible, and they will deny you. There will be statements given to the press, not only refuting what you did, but they will add that you are dangerous and probably communists. Now here is what we, the Nation of Islam, will not do. We will not ask the people of Harlem to march anywhere at any time. We will not send black men and black women and black children before armed, crazy white devils, but we will not deny you. We will make a statement to the press. I will say that yesterday's demonstration is symbolic of the anger in this country. Angelo says she left the meeting in a fog of defeat. Black despair was still real. The murders would continue. That evening, the radio, television, and newspapers bore out Malcolm's predictions. Later, Abby Lincoln recalled, she said the men in black armband, the women in black veils. She says that Chet Huntley, the newsman on the evening news, lied, saying we had bicycle chains and brass knuckles. She later disbanded the group, she said, because some people like to be seen more than anything else. And Abby Lincoln's own disillusionment and disappointment are evident, and it may be maybe the beginning of her turning away from such outward forms of protest, though she would continue to be engaged throughout much of the decade. During this time, Paul Marshall continued to, quote, be as much out in the world as politically as I could be. She was a member of a number of groups, and she had been associated with a group called American Youth for Democracy, which was called the Communist Front. Her involvement in left-leaning organizations meant that she was constantly interviewed by the State Department before she traveled. Malcolm was not just a revered leader to her, but a central figure in helping her reconcile the relationship between her desire to be politically active and to create art. She said, I remember once I said to Malcolm, I've been wrestling with whether it isn't indulgent and self-centered of me to be sitting here writing, and he really made it clear. Oh, I'll just leave this up here. This is just a picture of the various people in that circle. She said, he made it clear to me that struggle is fought in many ways, on many fronts, and literature was certainly one of the fronts. The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, her novel, was my contribution to that period. She says, I was part of that community of people who were becoming politically aware, radicalized, and involved in the movement, and Malcolm and I just had an easygoing kind of relationship in which he knew that sometimes to just get away from the pressure, he could get on the phone and just talk to me. And I remember the last time I saw him, I threw a New Year's Eve party, and he came, and I had called him because I knew the pressure he was under, and I knew that the powers that be had decided that he had to go. So I just called him, and I said, I'm doing this disgraceful thing of having this New Year's Eve party, which I very seldom do because I can't stand the way people drop in and drop out, but I'd love for you and Betty to come. And he said, we really need to. So they came, and I made sure that because in African-American culture, a lot of pig is eaten in New Year's, so I had lamb for them. And I remember he stood for the whole night with his back against the wall. The inevitable was very close at hand, but he did come. And I think he was a little disappointed with the party because of all that pig. But people were just so pleased to see him, and that was one party where you didn't get people flowing out. They just stayed and they went over, and that was the last time I saw him. So I was involved, but at the same time I saw writing was part of the involvement. You do get the feeling from time to time that you are somewhat ensconced in your study, while, as Maya would say, the woods are on fire. And the woods are on fire. So I had to wrestle with that until Malcolm really helped me see that I too was making my contribution in my way. This is a poignant passage with a sense of humor and pathos. Its focus on Malcolm and the way that he was beloved even by those who were not formally following him gives us a sense of his own sense of precariousness in those following weeks. If this were New Year's Eve in 1965, he was dead by February 21st. Paul Marshall would go to Grenada, where she completed what many consider to be her most ambitious and significant work. And at the novel's center, since Meryl Cabona, described as by Marshall as, quote, part saint, part Obeah woman, part revolutionary, she says, is an apt description for all it suggests the several ways I wanted her to function in the story. Meryl remains the most alive of my characters. Indeed, she seems to me to have escaped the pages of the novel altogether and is abroad in the world. I envision her striding restlessly up and down the hemisphere, all the while speaking her mind. She can be heard condemning all forms of exploitation, injustice, and greed, exhorting the little fella, as she calls the poor and the oppressed to resist, to organize, to rise up against the conditions of their lives. On a personal level, she's still trying to come to terms with her life and history as a Black woman, still seeking to reconcile all the conflicting elements to form a viable self, and she continues to search for the kinds of work, for a role in life that will put to use her tremendous energies and talent. She is one of my most passionate she is the most passionate and political of my heroines, a third world revolutionary spirit, and I love her. And it is not insignificant that the novel closes with Meryl headed to the African continent. Quote, and she's not taking the usual route to Africa, first flying north to London via New York and then down. Instead, she's going south to Trinidad and then to Brazil. And from there, in that city where the great arm of the hemisphere reaches out toward the massive shoulder of Africa as though yearning to be joined to it as it had surely been in the beginning, she would fly across to Dakar and from there begin the long continent journey to Kampala. She does not go the Black Atlantic route mapped by Paul Gilroy, the trajectory of the Black male intellectuals about whom he writes, but instead she goes the global South, the Black South, the route of the Middle Passage, first to the west coast of Brazil, which has the largest population of Africans outside of the continent, and from there she flies to West Africa, cutting out the Europe and the U.S. altogether. As with the fictional Meryl, Maya Angelou would live throughout the continent between Cairo and Ghana, and Abby continued to perform and record, traveling throughout Africa. And eventually, the marriage with Max Roach would come to an end. It is a rich and complex marriage, but unsurprisingly a deeply abusive one. And although they are the epitome of the moment and the movement, symbolic of a kind of artistic and political excellence and love, that role is a hugely burdensome one for her to play. And though she would always credit him with inspiring her growth as a woman, as an artist, his rage would become too difficult for her to bear, and eventually she would leave him, returning to her mother's home in California. His possessiveness had made it difficult for her to pursue her acting ambition, and their militance had caused problems for her in the recording industry. After her divorce, she faced both personal and professional challenges. Quote, it was the women who helped bring me through. At first it was Maya. I visited with her at the beach house in Malibu where we listened to the ocean and talked and talked and talked. And later it was Miriam Makeba, who had been her friend. Oh no, I didn't mean to go back. Who had been her friend and neighbor in New York, who invited her to Africa, paid for her ticket, and flew her to Guinea first class. She would stay on the continent for 2 months. She watched Miriam Makeba perform, and while there, she traveled to a few newly independent countries. In Guinea, where Makeba lived with her husband, Kwame Ture, the former Stokely Carmichael, Sekou Touré, the first African president of the country, bestowed the name Aminata on Abby Lincoln. And in Zaire, the former Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Minister of Information named her Moseka, which means God of love in female form. She would use the name Aminata Moseka throughout her career. According to Lincoln, it was during or immediately following her trip to Africa that she began hearing songs, not only lyrics, that's Touré. She began hearing not only lyrics, but also melodies. And the first song she heard was People in Me, which she later recorded while touring in Japan. Miles Davis came to see her backstage and lent her his musicians, Al Foster, Mtume, and David Liebman, and she recorded what would become her first solo recording in a decade, People in Me. Ironically, while she credits her trip to Africa with allowing her to hear the song, the lyrics testify to a full mixture of cultures, ethnicities, and nationalities. She says, "I found people in me after my return from Africa. I came home with a realization that I was a mixture of African, Indian, and Irish ancestry, and I was still African. I hadn't been bastardized as some people thought themselves to be. I was just a pure-blooded human being." I want to leave you with Abby Lincoln, with her first original composition written and performed by a woman standing in front of a band that she leads, singing music that she has written on the precipice of a new phase of her life, having absorbed the lessons of the period we covered today, emerging, scarred but beautiful, with a spiritual and artistic depth, a sense of wisdom that includes but is not limited by politics, a desire for a contemplative life that allows her to hear the truths that the universe and her inner voice and her ancestors want her to tell so that she may communicate them through her writing and through the abundance of her song. I want you to listen for the simplicity of the melody, the circularity of the song, the abundance of the lyrics and the message. People in me, all kinds of people, conflicting people, maybe even evidence of violence, but certainly evidence of love, full of possibility, carried in me, in between and through time. Can we cue the song? And there's no video.
Some say the world is cold and that it's hard to find a friend. But every time we're down and out, somebody takes us in. Sometimes somebody's wicked, and sometimes somebody's true. But there will always be somebody sticking with you and me. Because the people we know are the people who say, I got some Indian in me, I got some Irish in me, I got some Hawaiian blood, I got some people in me, I got some people in me, I got some people in me, I got the whole of Africa turning in me. I got some Chinese in me, some German in me, some Japanese blood, and blood from Vietnamese. I got some
you. I hope it plays in your ear for the rest of the night. Thank you.